Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Hi everyone, calling in from my parents' basement. Feel so un-mermanish. In Ken's wonderful introduction, he mentions we cover everything from unicorns to UFOs. According to the rules of Nightlight, Stevie Ray Vaughan fits into that category. Instead of covering ancient history, our guest, Andy Aledort, my piston driving mama, and I are going to focus on more recent history, but we will be discussing many historic figures. I don't know how all the ins and outs of Facebook, maybe because our guest and I have a mutual friend. So our guests, Facebook live stream lockdown videos started showing up. Maybe that's how it happened, but started watching them and realized, hey, that's the guy who was on Greg Martin's Lowdown Hoedown last fall out of Bowling Green's WDNSFM.com on Monday nights from 8 to 11. So, Greg, there's your free plug. Anyhow, our guest is Andy Aledort, and he is someone who did a lot of live streams to bring some blue sky to the monotony of the pandemic lockdown. He is the co-author of the very informative biography of Stevie Ray Vaughan, which is entitled Texas Flood. He is an accomplished musician and teacher, fronts the band The Groove Kings, and has been in bands with prestigious members, and is a senior editor and transcriber for Guitar World magazine. You can learn more about Andy by going to his website, Andy, ANDYALEDORT.com. Hi, Andy. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, Mark. Good to talk to you tonight.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to tonight's show. This is going to be a lot of fun. Just thrilled to have you as a guest.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm sure there's so many listeners tuned in right now who are in high school and college, and like that 82 to 90 time period, and all of us would have heard a lot of Stevie Ray's songs on the radio, on the rotation on MTV, and if they're like me, thought, Stevie Ray was, a great musician and deserved like the sudden international international acclaim. After reading your book, I learned his music career started almost 20 years earlier at just a kid. You have a terrific, thorough biography of Stevie Ray, but it's also a very insightful book about his older brother Jimmie.
Absolutely.
It really is a portrait of a family. So, Andy, let's start at the beginning, and we'll work our way up to the Alpine Valley.
So when you say the beginning, where do you want me? What are you thinking of as the beginning?
Oh, okay.
I'm wondering. There's a lot of beginnings, so there could be, start jumping off point.
Let's just start with the family. Mom and dad. Jimmie and Stevie Ray are born little kids, and they have.
In Stevie's story, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I had, just to be clear, I had thought that you meant just sort of the beginning of how the book happened, but I'm happy to start with Stevie's story. Stevie's story is, his parents are both from Texas. His father was the son of a sharecropper, so he grew up on a plantation. This is Big Jim Vaughan. And it's sort of interesting because Jimmie Vaughan, the guitar player that most people know, he spells his name Jimmie, which is unusual, but his dad spelled it the same way. So Big Jim Vaughan, he was Jimmie Vaughan, also Mmie. Jimmie Lee Vaughan, and his dad died. This is Big Jim Vaughan, Stevie Ray Vaughan's dad. So Stevie Ray Vaughan's grandfather, his father's father, died when his father was only 9 years old, in the middle of the Depression. So his father grew up very tough times, picking cotton, working in a plantation, and I don't know how much schooling he got, or time spent beyond elementary school. I really don't know, but probably not much because he had to work. The whole family had to pick cotton to make enough money to survive. And then eventually he gets a job at, I think it was actually a 7-Eleven. This was the beginning of 7-Eleven, franchises in the, I have to recall, probably 1950, 49 or 50. And he meets Martha Vaughan. Martha Cook is her maiden name. And they start dating, and they end up getting married. And but prior to that, just to fill in a little more, and we go into this in the book about Big Jim. He, was a World War II veteran. He was in the Navy, and it's sort of interesting. He was a lot like my father, and they were almost the same age. Big Jim Vaughan was in the Navy on an aircraft carrier in the Philippines on the USS Saratoga. And my dad was in the Navy on an aircraft carrier in the Philippines, too. And so I don't know if they were on the same boat. That would be a crazy coincidence. But they were both on aircraft carriers floating around the Philippines trying to save the world from fascism. And the detail about Big Jim, which is important in trying to understand Stevie and in telling, I think, any laying the groundwork for a solid biography, you need good sources. And in our New York Times review, as you may have mentioned, the book that myself and Alan Paul wrote about Stevie, Texas Flood, Inside Stories, Stevie Ray Vaughan, it made the New York Times bestseller list. And the New York Times said a biography is only as good as its sources, and Texas Flood has about as good a sources as you could ever want, with his big brother Jimmie Vaughan and the whole family, surviving family members all taking part in helping us write the book. So Jimmie Vaughan provided the detail, incredible detail about his dad. And so, they get married and they have two kids, and Jimmie Vaughan is born first in 1951, and then 3 years later, Stevie Ray Vaughan is born, 1954, and so we have the two brothers, and Big Jim could play a little piano, but it wasn't something that he did often. But he did have a tremendous love of music, and in fact, his courtship to Martha involved them going out dancing, to bands playing in juke joints in those days in Texas, playing most likely country and western swing and stuff like that. And he was a music fanatic, and he had a lot of records, 78s, and in fact, from going out and hearing music and being such a fan, he became friends with members of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, which they were the biggest band in Texas, one of the biggest bands in popular music at the time. So they were stars, and they would come over the Vaughan household, members of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, to play cards and play dominoes. There were all these domino games in Texas that people would play, like Nello and Low Boy, 42. Those are some of the games. And so even though Big Jim didn't play, he was very enthusiastic about music and had musicians in his house all the time. In fact, another guy came over that had played with Chuck Berry. Jimmie Vaughan tells a story, and he had his initials inlaid in the fretboard of the guitar, just like a lot of the famous rock and rollers did, like Elvis Presley. So Jimmie said the guy came over with his acoustic guitar and played Chuck Berry songs, and it was like a huge deal. So the point of this is that Jimmie and Stevie Ray Vaughan both grew up in a household that was extremely enthusiastic about music, filled with music, and filled with musicians. And so, and I can't leave this out, their mother's brothers, so Joe Cook and his name is escaping me right now. I'd have to look at the book. The other brother, both played guitar and taught Jimmie and Stevie some of the first chords that they learned. So they had two uncles that played, and the guitar, and they both got guitars at very young ages. Jimmie got a guitar when he was about 12, and Stevie got a guitar when he was 7. And in fact, Jimmie probably had a guitar before that when he was 10, I think. And 12, like a guitar, electric guitar. So it was the most natural thing for them to start to play guitar. They were just surrounded by it.
Yeah, Andy, were you thinking of Joe Allen Cook?
No, there's Joe Cook, and then I don't have a book in front of me, so I feel terrible. I can't remember the Gerald. Gerald is the brother. So
Okay.
Joe and Gerald.
Okay. And Big Jim was drinking some. We'll get into that later too.
Well, whenever. I mean, you brought it up, so we could talk about it some. The whole thing about Big Jim's drinking, we didn't want to make a big deal or too much of a deal of it in the book at the risk of it seeming salacious and, something that was there to help sell books because it was like dirty laundry. Just a lot of books are like that. So that was the last thing we were interested in. The reality was, now Jimmie did talk to me about it, which really helped to put it in perspective, which was that some of his coworkers, well, eventually, when they were young, very young, he started to become an asbestos worker, traveling constantly and having to uproot the family to move wherever there was work. So, like when buildings were being constructed, he would go in when they would run the pipes and they would mix the asbestos like mud, almost like plaster. And, of course, they didn't know about mesothelioma and, the cancers that's related to asbestosis and all that. There was not much awareness to that in those days, which, of course, he did get, and it contributed to his death, which was terrible. But that's what he did. And so what Jimmie told me was there would be days where he'd come home from school and the dad would be home and a couple of the guys he worked with would be all sitting in the kitchen with a big bottle of whiskey, and they would just drink, like, a lot. And, Jimmie said that if he walked in, they would all stop talking and look at him, and it made it very obvious to him, even as a little kid, that, they must have stopped talking because they didn't want him to hear whatever it was they were talking about. So there was a negative connotation to this whole scenario. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it wasn't drinking and everybody was jovial and happy all the time. There was the dark side to the drinking that Jimmie could see. And I guess he talked to his mother about it when he was young, and he said his mother would say, well, they're just drinking men. That's how she would describe them, characterize them. And I think in the 50s, that's how it was thought of. It wasn't unusual,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you watch the TV show Mad Men, which is the early 60s, those Madison Avenue guys are drinking like in their offices in the daytime, and smoking. And, my dad, because he's the same generation, drinking and smoking, it was all part of socializing. It was not, it was the opposite of being it was the opposite of being frowned upon. In fact, it was the nature of the way things were. There were alcohol ads on television all the time, and people drank, and people smoked. People smoked cigarettes all the time, They smoked on TV, I mean, it was a different world, so you have to see it within the context. But apparently, Big Jim could lose his temper if he'd been drinking. And the only reason I have any awareness to that is because Stevie talked to me about that in the interviews I did with him, within the reference of his own substance abuse problems. Like, he wasn't trying to say to me, oh, my dad, had a big problem with alcohol. He was trying to say, I grew up in this environment, and drinking was accepted, and it was part of being an adult. And so he was attracted to it because, it's just the way things are. But then he said that he did experience a lot of difficulties in his years growing up because of alcohol in the household, but it didn't have the effect on him of him not wanting to drink. You know what I mean? He said that, and this is Stevie telling me this, that he doesn't understand why he wasn't averse to drinking, having grown up in a difficult environment. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it was the opposite. And so you could go into a whole long psychoanalysis of that if you wanted to, but the point is it doesn't really matter because, he ended up drinking. And so did Jimmie, and Stevie reached a point where he almost died from it, so he got sober. And that's a huge part of the book is his dedication to sobriety. And in fact, then Jimmy Vaughan became sober because of his brother.
Mm. And
he has a beautiful quote, when Stevie Ray Vaughan was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years ago, Jimmy Vaughan said, I taught little brother how to play guitar, but little brother taught me how to be sober. So anyone who has any experience with substance abuse and alcohol in their family, they're well aware of how tough that terrain is, and how difficult it is to overcome also.
Okay. Well, we'll pick up, with this, maybe a little bit later in the show. But let's keep working on that theme where, like you just said about what Jimmie said. They both were learning things from each other, and Jimmie is 3 years older. He's starting his career, and Jimmie has a big name for himself. You mentioned the Texas Playboys were the biggest band in Texas. Jimmie kind of becomes almost the same thing in the later 60s. And Stevie, his little brother's watching him.
Right.
Yeah. So what's going on with Jimmie as he's developing his career?
What happened was, Jimmie tells a story, and we included in the book, of when he was 12 or 13, he broke his collarbone playing football in school. And while he was laid up, his dad came home with a Gibson 125, little small-bodied, hollow body electric guitar, like a real starter sort of kid's guitar, student guitar. Mm-hmm. I had the opportunity to play that guitar, and we took some pictures because when we did the Texas Flood book event, when our book first came out in August of 2019, we did one of the first things we did was a book tour in Texas, and one of the stops was in Dallas, where most of his family, Stevie Ray Vaughan's family, still lives, and it's where Stevie's buried at Laurelland Cemetery. But his Stevie's cousin, Gary Wiley, has the guitar that was Jimmie's first electric guitar, which actually ended up getting passed down to Stevie, so it was Stevie's first electric guitar too. And so I got to play the guitar, and we took some pictures, and it was really cool. There were strings in the case that was the strings from when they were little kids. Those strings were still in the case. These old black diamond strings from like 1958, 59, 60. And so Gary, the cousin who, participated in the book as well, as did a variety of the cousins. Sydney Cook, one of Joe Cook's daughters, and Linda Cassio, another one of the cousins, and Gary Wiley. They were all really indispensable in the writing of the book. But Gary brought the guitar, and we got to play the guitar. So Jimmie gets this guitar when he's 13, so that's like 1964. And he progresses very quickly. So by 1965, he has a band, and he's out playing. And the band's called the Swinging Pendulums. And then he joined a band called Sammy Laurie and the Penetrations. And so, he is all of 14 years old, and he has already sort of decided that he's not that interested in school,
Mm-hmm.
And he just wants to play guitar, and he's really into cars, too. So they have a lot of hot rod magazines, and he told me that cars and guitars were like the same thing, and I don't know how old you are, Mark. I'm 64, so, Jimmie was born in 51, Stevie in 54, I was born in 56. So when I was a little kid and when they were little kids too, they were a little older than me, Big Daddy Roth, the car designer, whose symbol character he came up with was Rat Fink. And Big Daddy Roth did all these crazy customized cars. In 1962, 63, that was like the coolest thing imaginable. 64, and George Barris, the other car designer who did the Batmobile and stuff. And so this was, the early 60s. It was, the explosion of youth culture in America, combined with the beginnings of counterculture that grew out of the beat movement in the 50s. So I'm only bringing all this up because it really plays a huge part in what people like Jimmy Vaughan and Stevie Ray Vaughan tuned into. And, as the counterculture grew through the 60s, that had everything to do with the shift in popular music to, what the things that the Beatles were able to accomplish in the Rolling Stones. And Stan with the civil rights music and folk music and Bob Dylan and the amalgamation of all of these different things about American life and culture coming together and then being the flashpoint for new art and music, that young artists in the early 60s and mid-60s were doing. So my point is only that this was a real thing, a real visceral thing that people could connect to, and Jimmy Vaughan connected to it with guitars and car culture. And, to go back to the 50s a little bit, Sam Phillips, from Sun Records,
mm-hmm.
he tapped into sort of the beginning of the power of youth culture in creating rock and roll music from rockabilly music, the mixture of country music and, white country music and black R&B and soul to create rockabilly, which then eventually turned into rock and roll. But that was, music for kids. Because before that, on television, on the radio and stuff, most of the music was for adults, whether it was Vic Damone and Frank Sinatra and stuff like that. Elvis Presley shows up, and Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps, and this was definitely music, youth-oriented music. So, and then you had Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean. I mean, this was what was happening. It was a real thing. Little Richard, black and white culture coming together. And that you saw that in folk music too. With it was so tied to the civil rights. So not only did you have black and white people come together for the same causes, which were social justice, but Pete Seeger might be playing Woody Guthrie songs, Fight a Hammer, but a lot of the old black blues musicians came back. Mississippi Fred McDowell and Lonnie Johnson and people like that, and Cemetery and Brownie Brigade. So there was a wholesale embrace of black music in white culture that hadn't happened before. And all of this has everything to do with Jimmie Vaughan. Because he said, he'd hear Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf on the radio, and it was the scariest, most exciting music he ever heard. And that's what he wanted to do. And so eventually, not much later, 66, he's 15, he joins an existing band with a record deal called the Chessmen, who are gigging all the time. And by 67, and he's 16, they're opening for national acts. They open for Jimi Hendrix, and Jimmie Vaughan traded wah-wah pedals with Jimi Hendrix. And by all accounts, Jimmy showed up at the gig, Jimmie Vaughan, wearing a jacket that was made out of feathers because he wanted to look as psychedelic as possible, So Stevie, he's seeing all this happen with his older brother. And his older brother now is making more money than his father. In 1966, he's making $350 a week, which is like an insane amount of money. So the quote from Stevie was, Stevie said to me, I saw my brother get exciting, not just excited, but exciting with something. It was like, look what Big Brother stumbled onto. And he goes, I wanted, well, he goes, what else was I going to do but try to pick up the ball and run, be a part of it. So I'm thankful that Jimmie Vaughan participated in the writing of the book because I'd known Jimmie for 30 years, and it did take a while to convince him that we had the best of intentions and, wanted to tell the story the way we felt it should be told, and, that Stevie got the book he deserved to get, because I got to know Stevie as a person, and he was a great person, so.
Oh, Jimmy's overseeing of this project does give the reader an authentic feel for both of them, the family as well as all the members of the band.
I wouldn't say that he oversaw, only not to be nitpicky, but just to be clear, he didn't really oversee anything. He just decided that, that he won't. He knew we were going to write the book anyway, so I think he figured, and he knew me and Alan for a long time. He knew me for 30 years, and he knew Alan for 26 years. So I had to convince him though. I had to say, Jimmie, look, a big part of it, Mark, is that there are a lot of misconceptions about the relationship between Jimmie and Stevie, and much had been made in other books about them having a rivalry and not having a good relationship. And I knew that wasn't the most important part of the story. Of course they had rivalries and they didn't get along. They were brothers. So
That's
close in
natural.
age and doing the same thing. Yeah. So anybody. I mean, Alan wrote a book about the Allman Brothers, so he got to know in great detail about the relationship between Duane Allman and Greg Allman, which by all accounts was a very difficult relationship. They didn't get along a lot. They fought a lot. I mean, like major, humongous fights. And I got to know Johnny Winter very well, and Edgar Winter somewhat, not as well as Johnny. Edgar's the sweetest person ever, and I love Johnny, and I feel very lucky to have gotten to know him. He's one of my biggest musical heroes, and he was a wonderful guy. But he was, pretty clear about the fact that, there were times when they had their problems. Brothers can. So this is not unusual. And so this was also true with Jimmy Vaughan and Stevie Ray Vaughan. And Stevie would say, it's just brother-to-brother shit, like it's typical. Because for whatever reason, as Stevie got bigger and bigger in terms of his musical success, people started to sort of pit them against each other. Well, who's where career-wise on the totem pole, and is that having an effect on their relationship? And whether it did or didn't, if it did, which it probably did, it would have been a natural thing, but it didn't change what was the foundation, which was the most important thing. So that was my point to Jimmie. As I said, if we write the story the right way, people will understand the true nature of the relationship between you and Stevie. Because I said, Jimmie, you told me about it, and Stevie told me about it, and I got to interview the two of you together when you did Family Style, about it. And I know that you guys loved each other very much and, had endless respect for each other as musicians and were rooting for each other harder than probably anyone else. So this is what I said to Jimmie. I said, if we tell the story the right way, all the other stuff about the rivalries and not getting along will be put in the proper perspective, because that's not the story. If you want to talk about the story of the brothers, there are two brothers who loved each other very, very much. And the best quote came from Denny Freeman, guitar player, Texas guitar player, good friend of them both. And this is in the book, and he said, there are no two people that Jimmie and Stevie loved more than each other. So,
after reading Texas Flood, that came across very clearly.
That's great.
Now, like you said, you wanted to erase those kind of misconceptions, and you did remove those, the Family Style chapter about the making that CD. Very good. It is about the two brothers working together and accomplishing a lot.
That's
becoming, really a very cohesive duo. After they had their separate careers. Occasionally they would tour together, but it was when they finally did the Family Style CD that everything that you just mentioned is laid to rest in that chapter?
Yeah, well, that was, I think the interview that I did with the two of them, it may have been the only interview that they together, and the only reason I say that is because I've never been able to find another interview that the two of them did together for Family Style. I interviewed Stevie 4 times starting in '86, and he always had endless praise for his brother and would credit Jimmie for sort of being the whole reason why Stevie played guitar and became the guitar player he was. I learned a lot from my brother, And in one of the interviews I did with Jimmie, I asked him a question which definitely wasn't the easiest question to answer. I said, when Stevie's playing his best, I said, I know how it makes me feel, and I know how it makes, I think I know how it makes most bands of music feel. I said, how does it make you feel? You're his brother, and his older brother. And, it took a minute to get him to really answer the question. And then he said, well, when I hear Stevie playing his best, it's like a religious experience almost, because he's tapped into that wavelength that, we don't know where it comes from. He goes, but I know what it is because I've been there. And the audience can hear it because it's real.
Mm-hmm.
You transcend the medium and you start to communicate with music in a powerful way, and the audience feels the connection and the artist feels the connection. He said, that's what I hear when Stevie's playing his best, is I hear it, somebody being able to express their emotions, and then the audience can relate to that. So they pick up on it because it's real, because there's something genuine about it. It can't be denied. And that's where all the power comes from.
Yeah, and Andy, you do say in the Family Style chapter, you quote Al Berry saying, the true beauty was the relationship between the brothers and how they brought us all in. And then later on, a couple pages later, he would say their tremendous respect for one another was incredibly humbling, and it maintained an almost spiritual vibe. So,
yeah, that's so beautiful, right? And Al was probably all of 21 years old at the time, so he was a very young guy, sort of experiencing this, world of high level of the world of music and recording, and so obviously it left a very powerful impression on him. So this is why I'm one of the things that makes me the happiest about writing the book is, that somebody like Al can be in the book and describe to people what the feeling was like in the room, and how much I'm trying to think of if there's I don't know if there's a better word than love, mutual love and respect that they have for each other. It's so much so that it affected the other bandmates and the entire situation. Nile Rodgers talked about it too,
Mhm. Yeah, Jimmie eventually goes on to formed the fabulous Thunderbirds, and Lou Ann Barton is in that band, and she would eventually work with Stevie, and when I saw Jimmie on that Dylan minor league ballpark tour about 12 years ago, Jimmie was brought Lou Ann back to be on that tour. So she's seems like she's always been a part of the Vaughan family as well. So there we are, back to Al Berry's comment about they're including everyone in what they're doing in the studio.
I don't understand what you mean.
Well, he said that brought us the true beauty of what was the relationship between the brothers and how they brought us all in.
Right.
And that just seemed to be their nature, is to be an inclusive people.
Oh, well, I mean, I guess I think it probably. I mean, this is a little bit of conjecture on my part. Stevie and Jimmie did know Al and Larry. The bass, Larry Aberman. The rhythm section on Family Style. They didn't know them. So, on the one hand, yes, it's a beautiful thing that they were so accepting of them and welcoming of them. Lou Ann, as you said, had a very long history with both brothers. So, starting with Jimmie in, I think, 1974 or something like that, when he first formed the Thunderbirds, it was with two singers, with Lou Ann and Kim Wilson. So, I guess, to just expand on it for a second. And so there was a group of musicians, that became very close. And, saw each other all the time, did a lot of gigs together, were in different lineups on and off over a number of years. So, they became, they were just the musicians on the scene as this blues scene was starting to, solidify in the town. And so, there was one degree of separation, between dozens and dozens and dozens of musicians. And the scene was growing at the time. So it was something to be excited about. And it was mutually beneficial, you know what I mean? Like, in terms of just individually, like, Lou Ann became an entity unto herself, where people would say, we're going to go see Lou Ann Barton, And it wasn't just within the confines of a specific band or something like that. Jimmie had done that from the beginning. He did it in the Chessmen when he was 15, and then when a little later he forms a band called Texas, which becomes Texas Storm, which becomes Storm, and he was he was a star almost from the beginning. So, but I always made a correlation between Austin, Texas, in the early 70s and what was going on there, and what was happening in New York City, in the early 70s into the mid 70s. Maybe because I'm from New York, but there's a similar thing. I had a friend who moved from New York to Austin in 77, so he got to experience the Soap Creek and Steamboat and these clubs when the whole blues scene was exploding and nobody knew who Fabulous Thunderbirds were, or nobody knew who Stevie Ray Vaughan was. And it was this incredibly vibrant, exploding scene. And what it makes me think of is in New York in 73, 74, you know, the Lower East Side, like, punk scene was this thing that was exploding. And then 75, 74, 5, you know, you've got Talking Heads and Blondie and the Ramones, and, you know, this whole thing is happening, which ultimately became huge. You know, the Police were a punk band, you know. So, you know, but punk in New York started with the Ramones. So, anyway, I always make the correlation that you know, something happened in that particular place for a reason. You know, like punk happened in New York for a reason, and you know, this blues thing happened in Austin, Texas for a reason. And just like any artistic moment, revolutionary moment, you know, it's going to bud and blossom and bloom, and then it's going to die. And so, you know, it had its years, and then it faded. And, of course, the same thing is true in New York. You know, by the time we get to 1980, you know, it's sort of over. Because things change, you know. So, but anyway, you know, they were all part of this scene. And it was a vibrant, exciting scene. And this is another point the book makes, is that, you know, the old saying, you know, it takes a village. You know, Stevie was able to blossom and grow as a musician and an artist because of his surroundings. Because there were so many great musicians, older musicians, people who, you know, worked with him and took him under their wing, and so he was able to become, you know, what he was destined to become.
Yeah, and you do a terrific job of recreating, like, venues like Antone's, where, you know, Stevie gets an opportunity, a rare opportunity to play with Albert King, and that became, you know, a lifelong friendship. I was watching some of their jam sessions later this afternoon to prepare for tonight's show. You know, they worked really well together, but you know, that just started in just kind of like the story that you portray, it makes it more like a dare for Albert to, you know, let this kid come up and play with him, and you know. Well,
you know, I mean, that never would have happened, and a lot of things never would have happened. I mean, there's a good chance that they wouldn't have. We don't know, but a lot of things did happen in Austin because of Clifford Antone. And so, and that begins with Antone opening a club that was dedicated to the blues. And sort of, you know, sticking a flag in the ground and going, we're going to be all about the blues. And that's what this is. And he sort of wouldn't take no for an answer, you know, even though he wasn't necessarily, you know, it was going to be a commercially successful endeavor to be dedicated to the blues only. But that's what he did. And he'd bring in Jimmy Reed or Luther Tucker or Jimmie Rogers, Muddy Waters guitar player, or Muddy and Freddie King and Albert. And so guys like Jimmy Vaughan and Denny Freeman and Stevie and, those musicians in Austin got to meet their heroes, like Muddy Waters, forget about it. And not only meet them, but play with them. And when guys like Muddy and Luther Tucker and Jimmy Rogers, got familiar, or if you would someone, familiar with these guys, they realized they could just come to town by themselves because Jimmy Vaughan and, the musicians could be their backup band because they were great musicians. They were great blues musicians. So, Clifford Anton was completely responsible for the explosion of the scene, although I would be remiss if I didn't mention Roger One Night Collins, wonderful person who was one of the owners of the One Night, KNITE, legendary, awesome club, which was the first place Jimmy Vaughan was able to play blues, and blues alone, which he began to do every Monday night, I think starting in 70 or 71, I'm not sure, but he played every Monday for 5 years there, starting with Storm, and maybe the Thunderbirds were together when he was still playing one night, I'm not sure. But, I mean, I do want to make the point that Clifford deserves a lot of credit, and he does. But a guy like Roger Collins deserves a tremendous amount of credit because of what the One Night was. And, I mean, it was exciting for me, Mark, to, there were people who said when they read the book, wow, I learned so much about Austin, the music scene, like not just about Stevie, just about, we really wanted it to be a visceral thing. There's a guy who helped us out a lot, and he's in the book, Bill Bentley, long time PR guy for Warner Brothers Records, but he's a Texas guy. I think he's from Houston originally, or Dallas. I don't remember 100%. But I think he started the Austin Chronicle. Pardon me for being a little hazy on some details, but Bill Bentley is a really, really important person who, grew up in Texas and was well aware of, just, I was talking about the youth culture, in the earlier 60s, and the Texas psychedelic scene is important too, even though Jimmy Vaughan and Stevie and Johnny Winter and people like that didn't really take part in the psychedelic scene. But Rocky Erickson and 13th Floor Elevators and their success as a Texas band was an important thing for helping other Texas musicians and putting Texas on the map. And one of the people who benefited from that is Billy Gibbons, and who eventually formed ZZ Top, because he had a band called Moving Sidewalks. And Moving Sidewalks' first single was called 99th Floor. I mean, that was completely like a tribute to Rocky Erickson, that song. And so, trying to remember, what was the name of it? Johnny Winter told me about all these crazy clubs, like the Love Street Light Circus or something like that in Houston, and clubs that grew out of the psychedelic scene and then sort of morphed into blues places as blues, in the late 60s started to become more of the thing. But anyway, there was a variety of clubs. Mother Blues is another very important place where Jimmy Vaughan would play, and Freddie King would come and hang out because he lived 2 blocks away, and then eventually he would start jumping up on stage with Jimmie. And Jimmie said he's 17, 18 years old, and here's Freddie King sitting in front of him at the bar.
Wow.
So Jimmie's scared out of his mind, and then Freddie gets up and sits in with his band. He's like, he can't believe this is happening, It's Freddie King, It's like a powerful person, an important person. So, but anyway, so Clifford opening Antone's and sort of creating this platform for music to grow and musicians, blues musicians to flourish, had everything to do with the explosion of the blues scene in Austin. And so, like you say, Albert King came to play there in '76. Stevie was 21 at the time. And Clifford said to Albert, I want this kid to sit in with you. And Albert was playing 2 nights in a row, and Albert said, forget it. We're not letting some kid sit in. Like, you could forget that. It's not happening. But then the next night, Clifford said it again, and Albert said, well, now you got curious. You wouldn't be pushing it so hard, if you weren't serious. And so it was exciting and fun to be able to tell that story in the book from people who were there, first-hand account. Jimmy Vaughan talking about it, and another Texas guitar player, Derek O'Brien, very colorfully describing what happened that night, and Angela Straley talking about it. It was a very exciting night for all of them, not just for Stevie. But, the other side of this, Mark, is that, so that was 76. So now we go up to 83. It's like a whole 7 years later. And Albert's doing this Canadian television show. And Stevie had just put out Texas Flood. And this opportunity came up because where Stevie was at the time on the road, he wasn't far away. And so they were able to sort of do a little detour, and Stevie could go to the Canadian TV studio to do this show called In Session with Albert King. The reality of all this was, so somebody says to Albert King, a guy that's coming to play with you on the show is Stevie Ray Vaughan. And Albert King said, no way. Like, there's no way that guy's playing with me. So forget it. But Stevie's en route, and he doesn't know anything about, these conversations. Albert sees him, and he goes, little Stevie, what are you doing here? Because he didn't know his name.
No, it's like history is repeating itself.
He knew him as little Stevie. He didn't know his name was Stevie Ray Vaughan. So he's like, little Stevie, what are you doing here? He loved him. He goes, well, I came here to play with you. And then Albert was like, you're Stevie Ray Vaughan? He didn't know. That's why it's so funny. It's like,
yeah.
He was like, oh, you're Stevie Ray Vaughan? He's like, you're little Stevie, And so you could see when you're watching concert, it's such a great thing, In Session. It's so great that it's all on video.
Mm-hmm.
Is you can see the mutual admiration society between these two guys. And Albert's like his godfather, big time. And Stevie would even say that in interviews after that. He'd say, I'm his godson.
Okay.
And, Albert says, he goes, you're going to be good. And he goes, well, you're pretty good now, but you're going to be better. And Stevie goes, I'm going to try. And then Albert goes, because I'm going to be back there with the bullwhip. So, they love each other. I mean, nobody played Albert King, like played Albert's licks like Stevie Ray Vaughan. Like he was so into it. I mean, he could really dial it up. And that's what he did on Let's Dance, with David Bowie. For most people, myself included, but most of the world, their introduction to Stevie Ray Vaughan was Let's Dance, the song Let's Dance, and the album, because it was on the radio all the time. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget the first time I heard it. It's in my author's note in the book. So I come on the radio. I was already a David Bowie fan. I was well aware of David, and I liked his music. So, but that particular track, sort of indicative of the times, it was sort of a disco-y, new wavy kind of song, beginning of 1983. And but then when the guitar solo started, I thought it was Albert King. I thought, it's Albert King playing with David Bowie? Like, that's crazy. Like, what a crazy combination. Like, how could that even happen? That's so nuts. But it sounded so good. I just thought, this is so cool. But then the more I listened to them, I kept going back and forth, like, oh, it's not Albert. Oh, maybe it is Albert. I really couldn't tell. And so in the book, there's a story of Stevie comes back to Austin after doing a session with Bowie. And somebody says, Stevie, how'd it go with Bowie? And Stevie said, oh, great, I just sprayed Albert King all over that sucker.
And that was one of Stevie's big breaks after the gig at the Montreux Jazz Festival. Wasn't a big financial boom,
not at all.
There was he met David Bowie there and Jackson
That's
Browne, right. and those were just some connections that came out of that short stint in Montreux that got Stevie, to where what we know him for today.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be, incorrect or necessarily inconceivable to say that without those 2 days happening, those 2 specific days in the life of Stevie Ray Vaughan, that maybe, we never would have heard of him. It's possible. Because from being in the right place at the right time, meeting Bowie the first night, who's knocked out by Stevie's performance, which didn't go over well, and it was booed, and they felt like it was a failure. David Bowie's, Stevie's manager, Chester Millican, did something that was very smart, which he booked them in the musician's lounge, other than the gig, just so he could get Stevie in front of as many, musicians and international music people as possible. It was a very smart thing to do. And so, because of that gig, they did the gig, playing on the main stage, but it was in the bar that David was able to approach Stevie, and Stevie was playing, and say to him, I love your playing. I want you to play on my next record. And, of course, Stevie wanted to do it, but because Stevie was an experienced musician, he was almost 30 years old at that time. He'd been around the block, so he was going to take it with a grain of salt. David Bowie wouldn't have been the first person to say, I love you and I want you to play my record, that Stevie never heard from again, it is the music business we're talking about. So, yeah, of course he was enthusiastic about it, but he didn't know whether it would ever happen. And likewise, the next night that Jackson Browne shows up and flips out over Stevie's playing his music and sits in with the band and offers him free studio time at Jackson's studio in L.A. And it just so happened that, you know, they show up in L.A. in Thanksgiving weekend, November of 82, to make what's essentially a demo tape that's virtually live in about 2.5 days, no overdubs. And they make this tape. And while they're there, Bowie calls the hotel that they're staying at to line up Stevie to come to New York in January of 83 to record at the power station on, you know, for the recording of Let's Dance, David's next record. So, yeah, you know, meeting those two guys really led to everything else that followed. You know, Stevie was able to make a record from meeting Jackson, and he was introduced to the world via his relationship with Bowie.
And it's examples like that where numerous times your interviewees just brought up the term destiny for Stevie's career. He was supposed. It took a while to get started, but he was supposed to be doing what he did, and he did it, you know, about as well as anyone.
Well, you know, I mean, this is not an uncommon theme in the world of music, because as you may know, every record label turned down the Beatles. Mm-hmm. They finally got from Parlophone and EMI. It was a terrible deal, business-wise. You know, they signed for a half cent in royalties per record, half a penny. I mean, come on. It's hard to imagine a worse deal than that, right?
No,
but nobody
you'd
would
be
an
internet radio talk show host.
Well, now things are different, so you have to go by the, you know, parameters of the day. Of course, a half penny got you a lot more in 1962 than it gets you now. And, you know, nobody wanted Jimi Hendrix. No one. Chas Chandler, his manager, you know, who was very successful with the Animals, who were huge, mm-hmm. couldn't get anybody to. It was difficult to get anybody to even listen to Jimi Hendrix, let alone be interested in signing him. And that was total luck, too. Because the only reason Hendrix got signed was because the Who's managers, Chris Stamp and Kit Lambert, decided they wanted to start a record company because they'd hated giving away all the money to the record companies to Shel Tamby, who was producing the Who. So they said, fuck that. We're going to start our own label called Track Records. And so who's the first artist they see, like the day after they decided they were going to start a record company? Jimi Hendrix. So that's how Hendrix got a record deal, because he got a deal from two people who never owned a record company in their lives before. You know. So like you say, things which then created the situation where we were able to say Stevie was destined for greatness, just like the Beatles or Jimi Hendrix. But that destiny may, not have been fulfilled, quite easily.
Yeah, and there was the Texas Flood CD, the first one that came out after Jackson Browne's offer. You walk us through, the follow-up CD. Throughout this time, you're back to the swinging from the chandelier type situations, and they bring in some other people to kind of hold the band together, but it was at this time when Stevie realized he had a real serious problem, and you have some really Jana
Lapidus? You mean his girlfriend later?
Yes.
Her name is, just to tell you, her name is pronounced Jana, but it is spelled like Jana. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No
okay, but she had some provided you with some really powerful insights, and after Stevie got to, while he's riding on the crest of the wave type, of success, he goes to a rehab center. It was either doing that or dying, and Stevie comes out of that situation doing what it seemed like he always wanted to do, was have like some kind of spiritual connection. That's throughout the whole book. You mentioned like early, I don't know, just, late teens or something like that. He's doing some meditating, and but it was after the rehab stint that that's when you're meeting him, and so many people said that he really became such a wonderful, giving person. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, there are many stories about him, as far as his personality as a giving person and a caring, considerate person, throughout his life. Anyway, so, it seems to be that was his nature, always.
And he just got sidetracked there for 20 years or so.
No, I mean, he was always like that, whether he was high or not. There are plenty of stories about him being that way, even though he may have been getting high. He was still that way. He didn't stop being that way. But when he got sober, the way he talked about it to me was that it gave him an opportunity to reassess himself and his relationships with people, and his own behaviors, and I said to him, I said, playing blues music is all about expressing your emotions. So I wanted to know if that task of expressing his emotions through music had changed when he became sober versus when he was abusing substances. And he said that it did, because initially he thought, well, I'm not high, am I going to be able to play? And then he realized that that was the least of his problems, whether he could play or not, being sober. What important was, was he going to be able to make it through the day, like actually feeling his feelings? So, the first thing was coming to grips with feeling his feelings and acknowledging his feelings. So what he said to me was, he had to sort that out as a person, and he started to feel differently about the songs themselves. So I said, so is it that the words of the song mean something different to you now? And he said, oh, absolutely. And he said, a lot of blues songs are about resentments. And he said, I was looking at those songs for a long time about my own resentments toward other people. But he said, like, if you take the song Cold Shot, for example, he said, for a long time I related to that song in terms of someone who gave me the cold shot, someone who treated me badly. And that's why I felt the way I did. He said, but then I realized that I was the one who gave the cold shot, that I was the one who was inconsiderate. And he said, it hurt when you realize that you hurt someone else. So for him, getting sober enabled him to, for his feelings and his understandings of human emotion to grow in all these different directions and not just be sort of myopic in one direction, as intense as it may have been. That it included a lot of empathy now for everyone else.
Yeah, and Andy, since you just mentioned empathy, Tommy Shannon does state, in sobriety, Stevie became more dedicated to the spiritual pursuits that he'd always been interested in. For the first time, he knew what he had to do and got the chance to help other people, something he had always wanted to do. And everyone else around him got cleaned up. Bonnie Raitt told you that too. So it seems that Stevie turned a bad situation into something good. And
well, yeah, I mean, he saved his own life first of all,
and it helped to bring him and Jimmie closer together, and they would go on to do the family style CD, and you already covered that, but it was so many positive things were happening. What's that, like 1986 time period?
Well, he got sober in 86, at the end of 86. So that was the start of his sober life, was like November of 86.
Okay. And he kept going on with a new outlook.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it saved his life. And being the kind of person he was, the intense dedication that he had for guitar, he directed that intense dedication toward analyzing himself and getting to the root of his problems and understanding himself and understanding life and understanding the value of relationships and human connection. You know, Stevie is the kind of person he was, or at least, you know, as well as I could tell from the amount that I got to know him. I can tell you, Mark, that the feeling you got when you talked to Stevie was that he was not interested in baloney and wasting time, because he could be very serious. And he would look at you and talk to you, and he wanted to be sure that you were understanding what he meant, and that his point was clear, because he was very clear in his mind what his point was, about what was important. So he wanted to make sure he could communicate that. So conversations with him, you know, could become pretty heavy because he would talk about heavy things. You know, I mean, it's nothing heavier than sort of, you know, the nature of life itself and its value and what's important. And, you know, and to him, compassion for your fellow man and helping your brothers and sisters was the most important thing that you could do while you're on this earth. And he would say that he would use the song Life Without You, when they would do a breakdown toward the end of the song, to sort of talk about that. And he would say, in exact words, he would say, we are all here to help each other. That's what it's all about. So that's what we should do. And you should reach out and look around for the people around you that need your help. And not only that, you should also be aware that there are people that want to help you and love you, and you should be accepting of that. Because that was a big revelation for himself, that he realized that he was shutting some people out of his life. The people that were trying to help him for years when he was abusing substances, and he didn't want to hear about it.
Well, and you know, you do give us examples of where Albert King is, you know, acting like, you know, dad, grandpa, you know, telling them, hey, you know, you have a problem. Here, you know, you need to get some help. Eric Clapton told him that too, and you know, it took some time, but you know, that did resolve itself, and you know, I guess we can just say, get into where Eric is bringing Stevie Ray on board for the, you know, what would be the last tour that Stevie Ray did. And, you know, we can kind of maybe wrap up the book with, you know, the success of those couple nights playing with Clapton. Oh, and Robert Cray, too.
Right, Clapton and Robert Cray and Buddy Guy, and I think Bonnie Raitt was there, too, but I know it's Buddy Guy and Robert Cray. And Jimmy Vaughan, you know, Stevie brought Jimmy specifically to be there for their shows. They didn't really do a tour. They just did these two shows.
Okay.
Where Stevie played, opened, and then everybody jammed with Eric, Alpine Valley, and I guess it was August 25th and 26th. And then Stevie died at 12:35 on the 27th in the morning when the helicopter crashed. But, you know, I did the interview with them together on July 30th. So it was like 3 weeks prior to Stevie's passing. And, you know, my main guitar that I got when I was a kid, when I was 17, is a 1961 Strat. It's very much like Stevie's number one guitar. And it's funny, I realized at some point that I bought my 1961 Strat in 1973, and he bought his 1962 Strat in 1974. And he would sit and play my guitar like the whole time when I would get together with him. And so when I got together with him and Jimmie for the Family Style interview that July 30th, it's 90, as usual, Stevie sat and played my guitar the whole time. And then when we were done, he got up, stood up, and handed me my guitar. He said, "I still love your guitar." And he played it a lot of times by then. And you know, I was supposed to talk to him again the day that he died. And so, you know, by all accounts, and this is what makes the story that much more tragic and poignant, is that this is a guy who had been through so much adversity in his life to the point of where he almost died from his substance abuse issues, where he had abused his body so badly, survives, is able to stay sober, which is saying a lot, because many people go to, you know, rehab and slip back numerous times. But not him. Becomes completely dedicated to sobriety, so much to the point where he's going to AA meetings all the time and makes it his life's mission to help other people, which is a huge part of the book that's very important. That the story of Stevie Ray Vaughan is a story of a guy who cared about other people and wanted to help them overcome their addictions. So not only was a guy who played the hell out of the guitar and recorded some incredible music, he also really tried to help people in their problems, and still is. 30 years after his death, people are getting sober because of Stevie's, which is a tremendous legacy that runs parallel to his legacy as a musician. You know, you'd be hard-pressed to decide which legacy is more important. Maybe the legacy of helping people get sober is more important, you know, so they could lead better lives. Could be. Pretty big.
You and a really long cast of big name people just really paint a very vivid and favorable portrait of someone. He's Stevie Ray's considered the last great bluesman, and so many people, Warren Haynes and Robert Cray, so many people. Bonnie Raitt just said many positive things about him, and we're left with a inspirational legacy.
Well, yeah, I mean, he did leave that for us all. Like anything great, it only gets better over time. Stevie sounds better all the time because his distinct powers as a musician, just become clearer to see with the passage of time. And, in its way, that was helpful to us in writing the book. We didn't intentionally wait 30 years after Stevie's passing to write a book, but that is what happened. And so we did have the advantage of hindsight and to see Stevie in perspective, in a historical perspective, more clearly because of the passage of time and his influence on other people, like the people you mentioned. So, it's just the story of Stevie's life is one that I felt was very important to tell. As I said before, one of the biggest, most important parts of it for myself was that he was someone that I got to know some.
Mm-hmm.
I got to know him well enough to know his personality, and so in writing the book, it was my goal to try to communicate to the reader Stevie as a person, what he was really like. And I can tell you that, Tommy Shannon, who's his bass player, who knew him as long as just about anybody, because he met Stevie when Stevie was 13 years old, Stevie was 15 years old in 1969. And Eric Johnson, who knew Steve for a long time, they both said that, we really captured Stevie as a person, and we're able to communicate that in the book. And, what can I say, Mark? He was a beautiful guy. I like to say to people that if you were at a party and Stevie was there, he'd probably be everybody's favorite person at the party because he was such a good guy. He was very funny, he was very quick, he was a very warm person, and he had tremendous charisma. That's just him. He was always great to me. What can I say? I can only base it on my experience, and he was always great to me. He was the warmest person. And so, in writing a biography, any biography, you need to tell the story of someone's life in terms of their career accomplishments and, their place in history, which we did our best to do. But the other part of it was the person, who's this person. So, not every biography is able to do that because you have to get those things from very specific sources or from your own experiences if you have them. So, anyway, we were able to, I think, draw from those different things, my own experiences and what we heard from family members and people who knew him as well as they did.
Well, that's one of the nice things about your biography is you knew you knew the two main subjects, Stevie Ray and Jimmie, and you knew some of the other people who were there. Plus, you just call them up and ask them, hey, just say Tommy or Chris Layton. What was the scene like here? And you get an authentic account to recreate this, time period. Different stages of his life. They're still with us. That makes your biography a little different than some of the speculations of just say someone today writing about George Washington. Letters, but
yeah.
you knew the actual
person writing about George Washington today wouldn't have been alive when George Washington was alive. So there's that.
I think you have a terrific biography. I highly recommend it. It's insightful, well done. I enjoyed reading it.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'm very happy to hear that. And we should let people know that there are a couple film projects
Yep.
in the works. One is a documentary using the book source material that's being done by the director Richard Linklater, who's a great director, known for Dazed and Confused, but he also did the movie Boyhood. Terrific director. So we're very excited that he wanted to make a documentary on Stevie, in connection with us in the book. So that has begun. And there's, talk of a feature film.
Wow.
And so we're getting closer on that, a biopic, which would be a different, project entirely. So that's very exciting too.
Okay. So let's move on to your CD, Put a Sock in It. You're really rocking on that one. It's what that's your power trio.
I guess you could say that, yeah. At the time the record was made in 99, and the recording was 97, 98, 99. My band was a trio. It was Paul Apostolides on bass, and Paul sings one song on the record on Put a Sock in It. He sings Someday After a While, the old Freddie King song, and he's an amazing singer, along with being an amazing bass player. So it's a great track. People should check it out. And the drummer is a drummer named Richard Roche. He's a good friend of mine, terrific drummer. So that was my band at the time. And half the record was made in my house here. And then the other half was made at a studio that a friend of mine had. So it was a relatively low-budget affair. But we're able to get really good sounds and performances. And that record came out 21 years ago now, 1999. But a year ago, a guy who, coincidentally enough, was friends with Alan Paul, my co-writer for Texas Flood, this guy named Fabrizio Persnotto in Milan, has a record label, Long Song Records, and he'd put out a record with Jimmie, the drummer from the Allman Brothers, which is, I believe, how Alan got to know him. But anyway, it turned out that Fabrizio was a fan of Put a Sock in It going back to when it first came out, and noticed that it was out of print. So he said, what do you say, I'd like to remaster it, create some new art, put it on iTunes, and, asked me if I would be interested in that. And I said, of course, that'd be fantastic. So he did a beautiful job remastering it. The record sounds better than ever. We created some new art. A very, very famous, renowned rock and roll photographer by the name of Danny Clinch, who's produced movies and videos with Bruce Springsteen and Pearl Jam. And this is a world-class photographer and has been for a long time. Back in 98, 99, I met him. Actually, I met him in 97. And he was already a world-class photographer then, but I didn't know. But he played blues harmonica, and I was playing all the time at a club in New York called Chicago Blues Club on the west side in the Village. And so I invited him to come play. And like I said, I had no idea he was this world-class photographer. I just knew he was a photographer. So I said, Danny, why don't you come sit in with us? And if you don't mind, maybe you could take a few pictures. So he took a ton of pictures that are phenomenal. And in the original issue of the CD, we were only able to, include two pictures, the front cover and the back cover. Fabrizio did the reissue. He said, hey, do you have any other pictures? And the reality was I had about 200 other pictures that Danny had taken that night. because he gave me all the pictures. So the reissue of the record has all these new pictures in the inside that people have never seen before, which is cool. And the record sounds really good, and
it does.
A lot of good things came from that record, from having made that record. People will tell you, as you may know, making your own CD as a musician, it's a great calling card to use. You just give people your CD and say, check it out, and they can, get an idea where you're coming from as a player. And Chris Layton and Tommy Shannon from Double Trouble, they heard tracks from that record before the record was done, and based on that, they hired me to play with them and record with them and play some shows with them. And then not that long after that, the record came out in 1999, so in 2001, I met Dickie Betts, started working with him for an instructional column in Guitar World, and I sent him the CD. The first song on the CD is my cover of a Freddie King song, instrumental song called The Stumble, and Dickie fell in love with it, and so he invited me, he gave me carte blanche, an open invitation to come and play with him at any gig that I could show up at. So for 3 years, I went and sat in with Dickie 25 times or something, like every opportunity. If it was within 125 miles, I was going to go, drive there and show up and play. And after 3 years of that, he invited me to join his band. For a second, it helped because he put it on, he listened to it, and right from the first song. His quote was a great quote, Mark. He said to me, he goes, "That first song will knock your hat in the lake." So he dug it, and it was helpful in that way. And so I'm happy it's reissued. And I have another CD that came out 10 years later in 2009, a live CD that is not a power trio. We had added a keyboard player by a great keyboard player, singer named Mike DeMeo, who's worked with Deep Purple, and he still plays with Tommy James and the Shondells. And Mike has worked with all kinds of people. He's terrific. So the live record, Andy Aledort and the Groove Kings Live at North Star, is 4-piece keyboards. And so as of this moment, those are the only two that I have out. But I have a lot more songs and plans to put some more music out.
Cool. Well, and the Put a Sock in It does have that Johnny Winter and Allman Brothers feel to it. Maybe a little bit of Robin Trower.
Oh,
that's a good. It's a good one. I really liked it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. When you're using some pedals, aren't you using pedals in Wish or Kings Grove?
Well, I mean, there's not a lot. There are some pedals.
There's a little Hendrix sound.
I think of myself as kind of an old school player in terms of, when I started playing bands in 73 and 4, my heroes were Jeff Beck and Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton, so those guys didn't use too many effects. In those days you'd have a wah-wah pedal and a fuzz face, and Hendrix used a Univibe on Machine Gun, when he was in Band of Gypsies, and so you hear some Univibe with Jimmie. Once he got a hold of the Univibe, he started using it all the time. Woodstock, and it's on it's very apparent on songs like Hey Baby and stuff like that. So the second song on the CD, Got a Thing About You, I'm using a Univibe. for the solo. And that might be the Trowery, like Robin Trower-esque kind of sound, because Trower, used the Univibe quite a lot. It became part of his sound. But that's it. I'm using a wallow pedal and a Univibe, and maybe I'm using a distortion box like a Tube Screamer. I don't think I use any fuzz phase, because I'm not a big fuzz guy. So that would probably be it, like a Tube Screamer and a wah-wah and a Univibe.
Okay.
Just sort of like Androids.
Okay. And you just mentioned the Band of Gypsies. You've been on the Experience Hendrix tours. It's like
I did them for a while. I did them for 2000 was the first one, which was a great show, a really fun show at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They did a big exhibit that was commemorating the release of the Jimi Hendrix Experience box set, 4-CD box set. Came in purple velvet. And so we did a big Hendrix tribute show that day, and all these different musicians that played. But Chris Light and Tommy Chapman from Double Trouble were hired to be the headliners. And so they asked me to play guitar, and also got the singer Malford Milliken, phenomenal singer that they had the band Storyville with. And so it was just the four of us. And Jimi Hendrix's father was there, Al Hendrix, and that was totally mind-blowing for me, to meet Al. And then Mitch Mitchell and Billy Cox were there, who showed up. I had no idea they were coming, and that completely blew my mind. And then after we had played 4 songs, all of a sudden Mitch Mitchell gets on the drums and Billy Cox picks up the bass, and Billy walks over and says, "Let's play Voodoo Child." So now I'm playing Voodoo Child with Mitch Mitchell and Billy Cox. And about 2 years later, I went to Japan with them to play at the Mount Fuji Rock Festival, just the 3 of us. And so what can I say, Mark? It's incredible experiences for me, like baseball fantasy camp times a million,
Yeah, I think a lot of people would just be awestruck by having Mitch and Billy come out, and it's like doing Voodoo Child, and it's like recreating Woodstock. Amazing.
Well, I can tell you this, that it's sort of funny if you think of it from a longer lens in a way. I had the opportunity to play and record with Mitch Mitchell, Billy Cox, and Buddy Miles. I made a record with Buddy Miles and Billy Cox, so that really was Band of Gypsies, a record called Band of Gypsies Returns that features a bunch of different guitar players. I'm on 2 of the songs, Machine Gun and Parasol. And I played a bunch of shows with them, and they asked me if I wanted to tour with them as Band of Gypsies, which is a shame that didn't happen, because I really would have loved it to happen. So there I am, sort of filling the Jimi Hendrix spot with them, and then get to know Chris and Tommy and start to play with them, and am called upon to play in the style of Stevie Ray Vaughan and do justice to that style of guitar playing. And then Dickie Betts hires me to basically fill the Duane Allman role, play a lot of slide guitar and play all the guitar harmonies. And so for a guitar player, there's nothing, I can't even imagine like something that would be more fun and a greater opportunity than to be able to play the music of those guys with the real people they did in the first place. But all of them, and I'm trying to say this in a factual way, they did say to me that they liked playing with me because I didn't try to copy or emulate the guitar player in question, whether it be Jimi Hendrix or Stevie Ray Vaughan or Duane Allman, that I just played in a natural way, where I could serve the music appropriately and still play like myself, which is, went back to when I was young and trying to learn to play. I did everything I could to learn the licks correctly, but I also wanted to bring something of myself into it so it sounded like music. It didn't sound like somebody, doing an impersonation or something else.
Right.
And they all told me they appreciated that, and that's why they liked playing with me, because it felt more like music being created than sort of replicating something that had already happened,
Yeah. Okay. Hey, Andy, we're down to about 3 minutes or so.
Okay.
Do you want to plug your website, your Facebook live stream show, and anything you want? Guitar World. We have about 3 minutes left.
Well, I would just like to say that I teach online via Skype and Zoom. I mean, I teach in person too. I'm teaching people in Paris and Israel and different parts of the world, and I've been doing that for quite a long time. And so I encourage anyone out there who's listening to drop me a line. It's very easy to get in touch with me via Facebook Messenger or Instagram, private messaging, or Twitter. I'm on all three of those. So pretty easy to get in touch with if you'd like to take a lesson. TrueFire is a company I've created a lot of instructional stuff for, and I have an instructional channel with TrueFire called Total Guitar Masterclass, where you can take lessons from me within the confines of the TrueFire environment, which avails to the students like 35,000 instructional videos from other instructors. So TrueFire.com. My website is AndyAledort.com. Or just drop me a line, if someone would like to take a lesson. So, or pick up a book, Stevie Ray Vaughan book, or one of my CDs.
You have quality material, and I'm just thankful that you were able to spend tonight with us and talk about so many legendary people that most of the listeners know who they are, and you're bringing that connection to the audience, and you're giving us just a great feel for what was going on at the time, and recreating history like Antone's scene. So this was a terrific evening. We're almost out of time, so Andy, I just want to thank you. I'll get the archive to you tomorrow, and Barbara will be back with Mary Joyce tomorrow night. So thank you again.